President Biden is in Germany today for the meeting of the G7, and what to do about Russia is on top of the agenda. I'm joined now by Richard Haass, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Gideon Rachman, who is the FT's chief foreign affairs columnist and the author of The Age of the Strongmen, terrific book. He joins me from London. Gideon, let me put to you a proposition that I've been wondering about, which is the economic sanctions strategy against Vladimir Putin is not working and is not likely to work. As long as you have this huge exception for energy, Russia is basically the first or second largest energy exporter in the world, Putin is getting more and more cash from that because prices are high, because of the crisis, because of curtailments of supply. So while his production may have gone down 20%, say, the prices are up 40%. He makes out. And there isn't an easy solution to this because you can't embargo the oil. The West, the whole world would go into a sharp recession. And the more you squeeze it, actually, the less supply there is and the prices go even higher. So is this economic sanction misconceived, or am I getting it wrong?
Well, I think you've certainly put your finger on the major flaw in the strategy. I don't think you should be too gloomy. There will be effects. There are effects on the Russian economy. You know, people expect it to shrink by up to 10% this year, and there are some things they're going to find very hard to get around. For example, restrictions on semiconductor imports, which may in time actually affect their ability to produce weaponry and so on. But you're right. They are currently getting something like $1 billion a day in revenues from oil and gas exports. And the Europeans, far from being in a position to cut them off, they're going to try that with oil. But gas, you're looking at a dependency that it may take 3 years, and that's being optimistic, to get rid of. And meanwhile, the Russians are actually turning the pressure back on the Europeans by threatening to turn off the gas tap in time for winter, which could cause the Europeans to have to do energy rationing in countries such as Germany and Italy. So, yeah, we can damage the Russians, but we're also learning that the Russians can damage us.
And one quick point on that. I mean, you've written the book, The Age of Strongmen. Putin is not likely to be particularly moved by the plight of ordinary Russians if he's getting, by the barrelful, all this energy revenue, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the political situations that the two sides have to deal with are very different. Putin is in a position to crush any dissent. Thousands of people were arrested for demonstrating against the war. So even if the Russian economy goes into a deep spiral downwards, there's not going to be, a direct effect on Putin. Whereas if you're a Western politician and you're looking at soaring inflation, possible energy rationing, you immediately have to start worrying about the next election. And so there is a kind of asymmetry there.
Richard, if you agree with this analysis, let me ask you another way of getting at this is, the economic strategy is not working. How to make the military strategy work? Because even there, the Russians are in this very brutal way gaining ground. Since the goal is to bring Putin to the negotiating table, he doesn't want to do it now. He doesn't see that he's losing. How to change that dynamic on the battlefield?
Well, I'm not sure, Fareed, you can change the dynamic to bring Putin to the negotiating table. If he's winning, he's going to want to continue. And if he's losing, he'll never accept defeat. He will basically hang tough until he believes things will move in his favor. So I think what we need to do, and by we I mean the West, is gear ourselves for a long war. We need to be providing Ukraine with more quantity and quality than we are. Over time, the Russians may run short of munitions. That's where some parts of the sanctions could have some bite. So essentially, we need to do what we're doing, just do more of it faster.
And Richard, do you think that there is a way to, I've raised this often, and Admiral Jim Stavridis agrees with me, find a way to escort Ukrainian ships out of Odessa? This is where most of their exports leave the country. Ukraine's economy, which seems to be contracting 45% this year, is in free fall unless it can export particularly grain, but really everything out of Odessa.
Well, you're right. And the grain matters not just to Ukraine as an exporter, but it matters to a big chunk of Africa and the Middle East as an import. And we can see considerable instability, food riots, or worse, around the world. The idea of organizing some type of a flotilla The model is in the late 1980s when Kuwaiti tankers were escorted by the United States in the context of the Iran-Iraq war. That's a possibility. We'd have to get Turkey on board, given its unique position in the Black Sea. We'd have to get the countries, I think, that import grain involved, the Egypts of the world. We wouldn't want it to simply be an American or a NATO effort. I think it's a long shot for Reed. I think it would be a bold step. Up to now, we've obviously avoided any type of direct military involvement. So I'm not saying we should rule it out, but one, I think it's risky. And two, I think it's a long shot that we'd be able to organize it. So we may need to think about imperfect approaches, for example, importing as much as, or exporting rather, as much as we can of Ukrainian grain out through places like Romania. Like I said, it's a second best outcome, but it's less risky and it might be something more within our control.
Stay with me. When we come back, I want to pivot to the Middle East. Israel has perhaps the most unstable government in the world, and it now has a new prime minister. There may be elections soon. What is going to happen there, and more on the Middle East when we come back. In Rahman. Richard, I want to ask your reaction to the Israeli government collapsing, or however you want to describe it. Was this inevitable, and what do you think comes of it?
It was inevitable. This was a 8-party coalition that really bridged the entire political spectrum. The one thing they had in common, Fareed, is they were against the previous prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu. But governing was always going to be difficult. Some might say it's amazing they lasted as long as they lasted. Anyhow, Israel's going back to its 5th election in as many years. My guess is Bibi Netanyahu's party, Likud, will get a plurality, but never in Israeli history has any party gotten the majority. So first, he will have the challenge of putting together a government. That will be extremely difficult. And even if he were to succeed, he'd have real problems getting a government that could govern. So I think Israel essentially is stuck with a political system and a society that is so divided that it can't essentially get out of its own way to produce a working majority.
Gideon Rahman, Israel is also one of those countries that has famously not really condemned the Russian aggression in Ukraine and is not being particularly helpful to Ukraine. Ukraine's president called them out on it. Could any of that change?
I think unlikely, to be honest. I think Netanyahu, if he does make it back as prime minister, is somebody who actually prided himself on having a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. The Israelis say they need to work with the Russians to some extent because the Russians are so present in Syria. They say they're effectively Israel's next door neighbor. And they probably know that there's a limit to which any American government is going to go in punishing Israel for not following the guidelines of US foreign policy. So I think they're going to walk this tightrope for a while. They're going to, not obviously endorse what Russia's done, but I think they're going to try and preserve a relationship with the Russians at the same time.
And Biden is, you're looking at the region. Biden is going to Saudi Arabia. We all understand why. He wants them to pump more oil. But the Saudis are going to be asked for something very tough on Iran, I imagine. Richard, can the United States find a way to both deal with the Iranian nuclear issue in the way that Biden and the Obama administration tried, which was some kind of a deal, and placate Saudi Arabia? Or are those two just contradictory goals?
Ultimately, they're contradictory because even if we were able to get back into the agreement with the Iranians, it would simply buy a little bit of time on the nuclear side. It wouldn't buy you anything on the missile side. It wouldn't buy you anything on the regional destabilization side. That said, I think the odds of getting back into it are long. So I think this becomes part of the new axis in the Middle East, Fareed. And you and I are of a generation where so much of the Middle East was along the Israeli-Palestinian divide, then along the Iraqi divide. Well, now it's along the Iranian divide. And no matter who's the prime minister of Israel, including Bibi Netanyahu, there is consensus on one thing, a hard line towards Iran. So I think Israel and Saudi Arabia share that. And the real question is, will the Biden administration that wants to pivot to Asia, that's obviously heavily involved in Europe, as we were just discussing, whether it has the appetite and the bandwidth to also take a tough line towards Iran? This could be the big foreign policy test of this administration before all else is done.
Gideon Rackman, when you watch the G7, the images coming out, is there something you think that they should be talking about that they're not? What do you think is what do you think should happen here?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty inevitable that they'll be very much focused on Ukraine, and I think that is probably the correct call. But obviously, that can crowd out other stuff. And, as Richard was saying, you could have a crisis in Iran soon. And I think that America has this perpetual problem of knowing that China is the big long-term challenge for the United States, but constantly finding its attention dragged away, during the Obama years to the Middle East, now during the Biden years towards Ukraine, in the Trump years towards North Korea. So maintaining this focus on the long-term strategic challenge of China is a big issue. And I think you're going to actually see more of that at the next summit, the NATO summit, where interestingly they've invited some major Asian powers to attend: Japan, South Korea, Australia. And I think that indicates that NATO is now looking not just at Russia, but also increasingly at the challenge of China.
Richard, I've got about 30 seconds. If you had a magic wand and you wanted these leaders, either at the G7 or NATO, to do something big, what would it be?
Do something about natural gas. That is the key to Russia's economic strength. Limit natural gas imports from Russia, obviously accelerate the military tools, but I don't think there's a game changer, Fareed. This is a long war. We've got to gear ourselves for that and avoid, if you will, fatigue.
I assume, and what you mean by that is also encourage American natural gas. So the United States is the Saudi Arabia of natural gas and could export a lot of it to Europe and the world, obviously, in liquefied form. Richard Haass, Gideon Rackman, thank you so much. As always, such a pleasure.